So it all started with a promise. It was a unique promise. It was a different promise. It was a promise unlike anything you or I could make. It was a divine promise. It had power and authority. There was strength in the promise. There was a man living in a pagan world, in pagan lands, from a pagan home, worshiping idols. And God chose this man to give this unique promise to. You see, the God that we know and worship was unknown to this man. All he knew were the idols that he worshiped, and all he knew was the pagan mentality of the land he lived in. But God came to him with a promise. This man named Abram got a promise from God that said, if you go out and take your immediate family and go and have faith in me, I will lead you to a land. And as you grow older, you will have descendants. And generation after generation, I will be with you. So he left. A man who worshiped pagan gods his whole life had one promise from God. Because it was such a unique promise, he left, had faith, and followed. Well, a few years went by and he didn't hear from this God again. And he started to get upset because the promises that he had, he wanted to come true. He wanted them fulfilled. See, he was in a land, but he was alien to the land. See, he had people following him, but he did not have a son. And he started to get upset, and he started to question if this promise was true. And God showed up again. God said, do not worry, Abram. Abram at this time was questioning if this promise was even true. To this God, he did not know that well. But God said, I've given you a promise. A unique promise. And from you, there will be generations. You will have descendants as numerous as the stars in the heavens above, more numerous than the sand in all of the seashores. From your generation there will be kings, and through each generation they will have land that I will provide them for, and I will be their God from generation to generation to generation. It was a tough thing for Abram to wrap his mind around. He wanted the generation, he wanted the descendants, he wanted kings from his seed, but it meant waiting a while. And God went a little while without talking to him again. Until finally he took things into his own hand. His wife Sarai had an Egyptian slave. And she said, God is obviously not meaning that you and I are going to have a child. It must mean that Hagar, my slave, will bear you a child. So Abram, whatever mindset he had to get himself into, did that. And he laid with Hagar, and they had a son, Ishmael. Things weren't always great, but then God came and said, no, Abram. That's not what I meant. When I said you will have descendants, I meant you and Sarah. Matter of fact, your name is no longer Abram. It's Abraham. Because you will be father of many nations, of many descendants. And likewise, your wife Sarai, no longer will she be known as Sarai, but Sarah. Because she will be a mother of many generations. Of many people. As a matter of fact, a year from now, your wife Sarah will become pregnant. And Abram, looking around at his 90-year-old wife and his 100-year-old self, it was only something to laugh at. A promise is good and all, but they're a little too old for bearing children. So he heard God's promise. He once again told him, you will have descendants, more than any number you can count. The land that you have, you will no longer be aliens, but your family, your generations will have, own, and live in. And a year from then, almost a year exactly, Sarah became pregnant. She had a child, and they named him Isaac. But then there was a problem. You see, Ishmael was no longer the son that he thought it was. God said that, yeah, you made a mistake, and I will bless Ishmael, because they had no part of it. They didn't know what was going on. I will bless them, but my promise, it's not going to go through him. It's going to go through Isaac. So Ishmael and Hagar, they left. And things were going pretty good until one day God just showed up like he does. He said, I need you to sacrifice your son Isaac. The one whom this promise that I've given to you will go through. And if any of you have children, honestly, if any of you have nieces, granddaughters, grandchildren, close family friends, they're young, you or I couldn't make that decision. But Abraham said, okay, whatever it takes to follow. So God pointed them to the direction, to the mountain that they were supposed to go to. And as they got there, and Isaac laid on the altar, Abraham took the knife, and almost when he done it, God said, no, stop. You have faith. You trust me. And he gave him his promise. That unique, strange promise again. He said, because you have faith in me, through Isaac, I will bless this world. He will have many descendants. His descendants will be kings of nations. He will have a land to call his own. And I will be his God. So they left. Abraham went home. Died a few years later. He was pretty old at that point. And Isaac took over this promise that was given to Abraham to live his life following God. And so he did. He found the land that God had promised him, and he lived there. And he grew old. And he had faith in God until one day he had a couple children. Esau and Jacob. See, Esau was the firstborn, so obviously the promise was going to go through him. Obviously. This promise that anybody would give. Where else could it go except the firstborn male? That wasn't what God had in plan. See, Jacob, he wasn't the best guy. He's known as a trickster. He tricked his brother out of his inheritance. See, any normal promise wouldn't have this strange man in it. He's not the normal person that you would have a promise through. This liar, this trickster, but God said, no, that's the person I'm choosing. Later in his life, God sent an angel and wrestled with him. He was scared out of his mind. He wrestled all night, and then finally God said, no longer will your name be Jacob, but it'll be Israel. And he gave him that promise. He said, your offspring shall be the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east, to the north and south. All of the families of the earth will be blessed because of your offspring. You will have a land and a nation to call your own. Through your descendants, the world will be blessed. Jacob changed his name to Israel and became the nation known as Israel. Jacob, he had a couple sons, 12 in fact, that we get the 12 tribes of Israel. And if you've studied the story, then you know the man named Joseph. You know Joseph. Loved by his father. The promise was going to go through him. He had the coats of many colors, which meant he had the blessings of his father. He had dreamed that he would be the Lord over his brothers. And for his brothers, that didn't always bode well. But for any normal, sensible person, the promise would seem to go through Joseph. See, Joseph one day went out to see his brothers. His 11 other brothers were working hard in the field, and Reuben, the firstborn, as they plotted and said, what are we going to do? They said, let's kill him. And Reuben said, no, we can't have that blood on our hands. So let's do something sensible. We'll just throw him into the pit. I mean, that's fine, right? So he was rationalizing it that way, and as he came closer, he said, we'll throw him into the pit. And then a man named Judah stepped up. He said, no, guys, come on. What are we doing? You know, you expect him to say this? Just let our brother live. But he says, no, let's just sell him. I mean, let's get some money out of it. At least something. So Judah sold his brother to some slaves. Joseph went to Egypt. You know the story. He rose to the ranks. He became king and lord. And his brothers had to come and bow down and pray that he would protect them. Years later, Joseph is the most powerful of his brothers, and what man chose for evil, God chose for good. I mean, Joseph is the hero of the story. From nothing to the most powerful person, to nothing, to the most powerful person again. But this is a unique promise. Because as much as God chose Joseph, that's not where his promise went through. You see, as Joseph laid on his deathbed, he got his brothers around and gave that promise to them. He told them the promise of Abraham and said, you guys will know God. And through you, God will create a nation, and you will have land, and the world will be blessed through you. And God chose a person for that. Remember Judah? At least he got some money out of it. So he's the person that God chose for the promise. A guy that would sell his own brother in spite. See, his life didn't get much better either, because after he left there, he got a wife. They had 3 children. And his fathers did in that time. The oldest son was growing of age, and he lay down and he got a wife for it. Was the oldest son's name. And Tamar was going to be his wife. Well, was wicked in the eyes of God. And because of that, he died. So the second son was supposed to lay with Tamar and have a child so that the firstborn son would have a descendant. But he refused. And he died as well. So they were left with no child. So he said, well, live with me until my 3rd young son grows up old enough. So she did. Tamar lived with Judah for that time. They grew older, and one day Judah went out to a city. He did it multiple times, but this time Tamar heard of it, and she raced to the city and got there. But she looked a little different. She put a veil over her face, wrapped herself with layers of clothing. And as Judah was in the city, he looked for a temple prostitute. And Tamar found him, his daughter-in-law, and convinced him to lay with her. He didn't tell him who she was. They had an arrangement. And then a couple months later, they were both back, and he found out that she was pregnant. And he was ready to burn her alive because of the sin that she'd committed. And then she told him and showed him the proof that he was the father. See, it was a gut check for him, because the sin that he was getting ready to kill someone for, he partook in. He stood up and said, she is more righteous than I. And from this weird relationship, they had 2 sons. And the firstborn, Perez, God would continue his strange, unique promise. You see, through Perez, there were some generations that weren't really noteworthy. Perez's son was Hezron. his son was Ram, and then Amminadab, and then Nahshon, and then we finally get to a man named Salmon, not the fish. That would be an interesting story nonetheless. But Salmon was a man who had a unique life, most notably known in the Bible for being a prostitute. It's strange. You see, you might know her as Rahab the prostitute. She lived in a city, an idol-worshiping city, a pagan city with a pagan family, a pagan home, and pagan friends. And see, while all this was going on, this promise was going on in the background. There was a man named Moses. They were in captivity for a few years. They fled. God gave them some commandments, but this promise, they weren't really on the front. You see, it would be fun. It would be nice to have the heroes be the lineage. From Moses to the leaders. But as we pick up with someone in the Bible, the next person in this lineage, this unique promise that God will bless the people through, is a prostitute. It doesn't make any sense. Way in the background, there were some spies that came to this city. And they ran around, and it was like an action movie, if you've ever seen it. They're going around corners, they're being chased by leaders, and there's people with swords and shields, and they're running, and they're just trying to find a place, and then this prostitute opens her doors and says, "Come in." So without thinking, they just jump in. She closes the door, and then, as the soldiers went by, and as she opened the door, they explained to her what they were doing. Well, they were able to get out, and she saved these spies. And as they got back, they got a plan. They realized what the place was like, and God gave them a plan. So this army marched down. And God said, "I want you to circle around the city a few times, each day. But don't say anything." So they marched around the city. They didn't even throw any rocks, didn't sling any arrows, didn't say anything. All they did was walk around the city for day after day. And then finally God said, "Walk around the city a couple more times, and on the last time I want you to yell as loud as you can. Make as much noise as possible." And so they did. After the last time, they let out a war cry, just screaming as loud as they could, praising God. The trumpets were blaring, and the walls came crumbling down on Jericho. And they rushed in, and they killed everybody. Except one family. A prostitute. See, they got Rahab out. She joined the clan. She joined the nation. She joined the promise. Through her, through Salmon, they kept the promise going. Salmon and Rahab, they had a child named Boaz. You might know he's in a book called Ruth, a couple chapters of the Old Testament. Well, that was their lineage. And then after them, Obed was the father of Jesse, who was the famous father of who? David. Yeah, David. Good job. So David, the king that everybody was compared to, the greatest king in the nation, had a pretty weird lineage. But he had an even more unique promise. You see, David, he was the youngest of the sons of Jesse. He was out in the fields. Nobody thought he would be anything until Samuel came and God said, "That is the one I want." So he anointed him and he became the king of Israel. But he had to go through a couple of things first. He killed a Goliath, a giant. He put up with Saul being a madman. He got kicked out as Saul lost his mind. He was on the run for years until finally he died and he became king. And man, he was a great king. The rest of the Old Testament, they compared if they were a good king or not by if they did what David did. He's the hero of the story. And finally, this promise is picked up through someone we can tell our mothers about. We don't really like to talk about some of those other people and some of the things that happened, but David, we can talk about it. But even David messed up a couple. You see, as righteous as he was, as many nations as he took, as many things as he got back, the Ark of the Covenant, as much as he praised God, there came a time when he saw a woman bathing. He had her come over, he laid with her, and she became pregnant. And that led to him killing one of his guards, to lying, to sneaking around, and God said, I can't let you do that. And the son that they had together died. And David repented, and he realized what was wrong with him. He said, I'm so sorry, God. And he fell to God, and he cried day after day, and said, I'm so sorry. But God said, don't worry. I gave a promise to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob before you. And it's continued to you, but I want to refine that promise. You see, your family, your descendants will be kings like you. They will be kings of nations. You will have the land that I promised you, and I will be with you and protect you and be the God of your generations from every generation on. But he said there's even more you need. Promise them that. From you will one day come a man who you will call Lord. He will call me Father, and I will call him Son. It was a strange promise. It was a misunderstood promise for a long time. They didn't know what that meant. But God said, more than land, more than descendants, there will come a Savior through your lineage. He had another son with Bathsheba, the woman whose husband he killed. His name was Solomon. Through this weird relationship, through this sin, God took what man couldn't fathom and continued his promise. You see, there were a lot of kings after. Each one, their son was king, but not all of them were as David was. See, Solomon had Rehoboam, who reigned 17 years and was evil. He had Abiash, who reigned 3 years and was evil. Then Asa reigned for 41 years and did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. And they say he did as David did before him. They compared him to David. Then he had Jehoshaphat, who reigned 25 years and was righteous. Then Jehoram, and then Uzziah, who reigned 52 years, was righteous. Jotham reigned 16 years, was righteous. Ahaz reigned 16 years, was evil. Then Hezekiah reigned 29 years and was righteous. Manasseh reigned 55 years and he was evil. Amon reigned 2 years and was evil. Josiah reigned 31 years and was righteous. And Jehoshaphat reigned 3 months and 10 days and was unrighteous before God. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb and say you probably don't know any of those people. And I'm going to be honest with you, I didn't know until I had to research. Some of their reigns were 40, 50 years. Some of them were righteous, as David was. Some of them were evil. Some of them took down everything that had to do with God and took on all the pagan idols and worshiping places and said, this is what we're going to do from now on out. But God was with them from generation to generation. Sin after sin. God was with them until one day they were exiled. Their once great nation had fallen. You see, the promise was on the forefront of every king, of every nation of Israel, Jerusalem. And he said, through these, I will make my promise. And he stayed true to it. After 50 years of an unrighteous, wicked king, the next generation was righteous for 40 years. See, God knew what was going on, and that promise just kept on going. After the Babylonian exile, there was Zerubbabel, Abir, Elikim, Azar, Zadok, Achim, Eliad, Eleazar, Mathan, Jacob, and then 2 people I know you know, You see, it was a strange promise. King after king after king, and then nobody. Just normal, everyday people. They weren't the heroes. They weren't the prophets. They weren't the kings. They weren't the leaders. Just normal people for 14 generations. It's a unique promise. Because it's not a normal promise. Mary and Joseph, they didn't have a normal birth. They didn't have a normal child. They had a unique child. See, it wasn't just about the manger. It wasn't just about the angel singing. It wasn't just about the start of a new timeline from 0 on. It wasn't about the shepherds coming from miles. It wasn't about the wise men asking for the king. It wasn't about the king getting mad and finding where the new king was. It was a unique promise that God fulfilled. Jesus Christ. Born in a manger in an unusual situation. See, this wasn't a normal birth. God never planned his promise to be normal. They were prostitutes, adulterous, sinful, wicked, idol-worshiping pagans in his promise until one day it was something more than a promise. It was a fulfilled promise. You see, as much as we look in December at the birth of Jesus, and as much as we look at the life and death of Jesus, and our faith is in his death and resurrection, his birth means much more than just a starting place. It's much more than a here, now look at the story. It's much more than just random names put together. It's God fulfilling his promise. It was a unique promise. Because what it took was a unique birth. Unlike any other birth that you or I could ever do. An unnatural. But what it represents, from generation to generation, after king, after wicked king, after good king, after normal everyday people, is that God keeps his promises. No matter what. In our lives, it's easy to forget that fact. It's easy to look over that. It's easy to look at our lives or look at the people around us and say, God has no plan right now. But we have a list in Matthew 1, if you're wondering where this promise came through. What I went through is the genealogy of Jesus from Abraham to himself, Jesus. The beginning of Matthew 1. All it's got is names, but it's so much more than names. It's so much more than random names that you've never heard of and can't pronounce. It represents a lot more than that. It represents that for each and every one of us, God is working to fulfill his promises. I challenge you guys. As you look at Jesus' birth, all through December, you're gonna get reminded of it. We'll have the nativity scene up here, outside. Everywhere you go, you'll hear Christmas songs and watch Christmas movies. You'll see baby Jesus dressed up in all the craziest things. But what I want you guys to think about is it's more than just a baby in a manger. It's more than just wise men and animals watching. It's a promise that God fulfilled. And he will fulfill the promises that he has in your life as well. Let's pray. Dear God, we just come to you this morning. As December's starting to come around, we'll see more and more about your Son. I pray that we would look beyond the aesthetics of the location of the birth. But God, that we would remember, since Abraham and the promise that you gave to him, you have been watching over us. You have given us the strength and the power each generation that if we have faith in you, you will fulfill your promises. God, it's easy to look over the part in your word that has just a bunch of names. God, we know that there's so much more than names. The promise that you gave, it's so much more than a normal promise, but what else do we expect from a unique God? I want to thank you for the ability to be here this morning, to praise you, to love you, to know you. God, the only reason that we can do this is because you fulfilled your promise in your Son. And we know that all the promises you made with him will one day come true. God, I pray for every person in here today. As we leave here, as we forget the message, as I'm sure we won't remember all those weird names and all those weird times and how long kings and rulers reigned or if they were good or bad or not. But God, I pray that we would remember that above all things, you are a God who keeps his promises. And God, as we face tough times, as we face difficult, unending, hard situations, that we would hold tight to that fact, that you care and that you will keep your promises. God, it's in your Son's name who your promise came to.